will continue to renew itself. It will build a sovereign, independent, socialist, democratic, prosperous, and sustainable nation. Mr. President, Your Excellencies, distinguished delegates, in short, upon exercising your vote, you will not just be deciding a matter of vital interest for Cuba and each Cuban family. Your vote in favor of the draft resolution that has been presented will also be an expression in support of reason and justice, and it will be an act of support to the United Nations Charter and to international law. On behalf of our noble, dignified, and fraternal people who, for a long time now, decided to become masters of their own history and their future, on behalf of the millions of Cuban men and women who resist and create on a daily basis against the most cruel and long-lasting unilateral coercive measures system ever applied against any country, and which should be abolished once and for all for the good of all, I respectfully ask you to vote in favor of draft resolution A/Res/78/L5 entitled The Necessity of Ending the Economic, Commercial, and Financial Embargo imposed by the United States of America against Cuba. We are better without a blockade. We are better without genocidal blockade. Let Cuba live without blockade. Thank you very much.
I should like to thank the distinguished Minister of Foreign Affairs of Cuba for his statement. We have heard the last speaker in the debate on this item. The Assembly will now take a decision on draft resolution A/78/L5 entitled Necessity of Ending the Economic, Commercial, and Financial Embargo imposed by the United States of America against Cuba. A recorded vote has been requested. We shall now begin the voting. Those in favor of draft resolution A/78/L5, please signify. Those against, abstentions.
The General Assembly is now voting on draft resolution A/78/L5 entitled Necessity of Ending the Economic, Commercial, and Financial Embargo imposed by the United States of America against Cuba. Will all delegations confirm that their votes are accurately reflected on the screen? The voting has been completed. Please lock the machine.
The result of the vote is as follows. In favor, 187. Against, 2. Abstentions, 1. Draft resolution A/78/L5 is adopted. Before giving the floor for explanations of vote after the vote, may I remind delegations that explanations of vote are limited to 10 minutes and should be made by delegations from their seats. I now give the floor to the distinguished delegation of Timor-Leste.
I thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, we wish to take this opportunity to acknowledge the presence of His Excellency Mr. Bruno Rodriguez Parilla, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Cuba, and we wish to thank the UN Secretary General for this report on the draft resolution. Mr. President, we have been enjoying strong bilateral relations with Cuba for more than 20 years. Within the bilateral cooperation framework, since 2003, Cuba has been playing a fundamental role in supporting our health sector through building the capacity of our national health system, by facilitating our students to study in Cuba and sending doctors and specialists to work in our country's health centers. In addition to the health sector, we have also had in place a cooperation project in the area of youth sports, art and culture, which allows us to send our students and sports athletes for training and to study in Cuba. Mr. President, the vote we casted today in support of this draft resolution represents our great concern over the adverse effects of this embargo on the well-being of the peoples of Cuba. We are of the view that the embargo prevents the peoples of Cuba from fully enjoying their human rights, including the rights to development, as it undermines the efforts of Cuba in achieving the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Mr. President, as described in the report of the UN Secretary General on the draft resolution, the embargo has affected the full potential of Cuba to be a more active actor in international trade and development and international cooperation. In addition, we have also come to the understanding that the embargo has directly and indirectly affected the critical sectors of the Cuban economy, including public health, nutrition, agriculture, as well as investment, tourism, and banking. Therefore, Timor-Leste joins other delegation here in calling for the lifting of the embargo, which will help the peoples of Cuba to fully enjoy their human rights, including the right to development in accordance with the UN Charter and the international law. I thank you, Mr. President.
I'd like to thank Timor-Leste, and I now give the floor to the delegation of Sri Lanka.
Mr. President, thank you for giving me the floor. Sri Lanka voted in favor of the draft resolution A/78L5 entitled The Necessity of Ending the Economic, Commercial and Financial Embargo imposed by the United States of America against Cuba. In keeping with past practice, this Assembly adopted with an overwhelming majority the call to lift the blockade against Cuba. It is not difficult, Mr. President, to discern the rationale. A cursory perusal of the United Nations Secretary General's report, A78/84, provides the answers. For 30 years, the General Assembly has been calling for an end to the economic embargo that the United States has imposed on Cuba since 1962. If sanctions have only created hardships and collective suffering to a population, what justification, we ask, can there be to continue a policy of repression? Mr. President, it is said that universal coercive sanctions can have unintended consequences and negative humanitarian impacts. As clearly seen in the Cuban scenario, universal coercive sanctions harm the civilian population more than the intended targets, leading to increased poverty, unemployment, and a lack of access to essential goods and services. It is also said that sanctions can undermine diplomatic efforts and hinder dialogue, making it more difficult to find peaceful resolutions to a conflict. Mr. President, unilateral sanctions and secondary sanctions aimed at universalizing the sanctions regime have been the most difficult aspects of any sanctions regime, aimed at elevating such sanctions to one of collective sanctions. Unilateral sanctions can never achieve the same status as collective sanctions without exaggerated claims to jurisdiction. It is a fact that countries perceive the implications of sanctions regimes differently from one another. If one looks at the bigger picture carefully, unilateral sanctions have not had their desired effect. It is therefore time, we say, to re-examine the continuation of the sanctions against Cuba and withdraw them. We call on all those concerned to lift the imposition of unilateral coercive measures that are not authorized to relevant organs of the United Nations and are inconsistent with the principles of international law and the Charter of the United Nations. My delegation is of the considered view that the potential drawbacks of these sanctions outweigh the intended objectives. It must also be observed that the target entities find ways to circumvent the sanctions or find alternative allies which renders nugatory the very purpose of imposing such sanctions. Mr. President, we must all remind ourselves of the fact that the imposition of universal coercive sanctions have been of little help and relatively ineffective in maintaining a conducive global order, improve the respect for human rights, and prevent the escalation of conflicts globally. The continued sanctions on Cuba against this backdrop appears misplaced and irrational. It is therefore time, we say, to revisit the continuation of the sanctions against Cuba with a view to their final withdrawal. I thank you, Mr. President.
I should like to thank the distinguished representative of Sri Lanka and now invite the distinguished representative of Solomon Islands to take the floor.
Mr. President, at the outset, my delegation acknowledges the presence of the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Cuba, Mr. Bruno Rodriguez Parilla, and thank the Secretary General for the report on Cuba, highlighting the impacts of the embargo on Cuba. My delegation aligns itself with the statement made by the distinguished delegate of Uganda on behalf of the Group of 77 in China. Mr. President, Solomon Islands voted in favor of the resolution as a reaffirmation of our support for Cuba and the cessation of the economic, commercial, and financial embargo on Cuba. The embargo on Cuba is not in the spirit of the United Nations and goes against the principles of the United Nations Charter. As member states, we are duty-bound to uphold the commitment to the purposes, principles, and the spirit of the Charter of the United Nations, particularly regarding the sovereign equality of states, non-intervention, non-interference in states' internal affairs, and freedom of international trade and navigation. Mr. President, the unilateral embargo on Cuba over 6 decades denies Cubans the right to trade, access to goods, critical and medical supplies, and violates Cuba's inalienable right to development. Nor does it reflect our unified aspirations to achieve the 2030 Agenda or the Sustainable Development Goals, which we collectively pledge not to leave anyone behind. Mr. President, Solomon Islands does not support the imposition of unilateral action or measures that perpetuate negative impact on the well-being of the people of another state. We therefore join the UN community in calling for the immediate removal of the embargo to restore faith in observing international law and the respect for United Nations principles. With the near unanimous support for the General Assembly on the resolution again today, we encourage the United States to reconsider its decision on the embargo in the spirit of goodwill and engage in enhanced dialogue and constructive consultation with Cuba. Mr. President, Solomon Islands acknowledges with sincere appreciation Cuba's partnership and commitment to South-South cooperation and its contributions to the international community despite these imposed measures. As a close bilateral partner, Cuba has trained more than 100 of our medical doctors, that are now saving lives around the country. We remain resolved in our stand with Cuba as we have done in the past, and to the ending of the economic, commercial, and financial embargo on Cuba. I thank you, Mr. President.
I should like to thank the distinguished representative of the Solomon Islands, and I now invite the distinguished representative of Indonesia to take the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, Indonesia reiterates its opposition to the unilateral coercive measures with external effect on the sovereignty of other states and reiterates the legitimate interests of entities or persons under their jurisdiction and the freedom of trade and navigation. The prolonged imposition of the unilateral economic, commercial, and financial embargo by the United States against Cuba clearly violates the UN Charter principles of sovereignty of states, non-interference, and non-intervention. It also violates international law. In this regard, Indonesia rejects any measure aimed at further strengthening the unilateral embargo against Cuba. This includes the inclusion of Cuba in the United States list of state-sponsored terrorism, especially on the basis of inconsistent arguments and without proper evidence. Mr. President, we are at a crucial time where unilateral acts are increasing and it's becoming more unacceptable. So let me highlight a few points. First, we are at the midpoint of the 2030 agenda, with a risk that our SDG progress is being stalled by the current post-pandemic global economic uncertainty, conflicts, and climate crisis. Cuba has the right to fulfill their economic and social development, and it is intolerable to further impede this while we are collectively fighting to bring the SDG back on track and advocating to leaving no one behind. Second, the unilateral act undermines our efforts to restoring trust in multilateralism. There is nothing that speaks more than this than a consecutive resolution which consistently and overwhelmingly receives favorable votes from the UN member every year, yet there is no significant effort to be made to address the problem. Third, humanity should always be put first, beyond any political agenda, let alone a single country's political agenda. The Secretary General's report clearly highlights the declining of life quality of the people of Cuba, particularly vulnerable groups such as children, women, and elderly people. Increasing infant mortality rate, deteriorating health system, and difficulty to access basic food and medicines, children deprived from their rights to education are unacceptable. Therefore, Indonesia urges for the immediate implementation of this resolution and continues to underline the importance of an enhanced and constructive dialogue to this aim. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Indonesia, and I give the floor to Spain on behalf of the European Union.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I have the honor to speak on behalf of the European Union and its member states. The candidate countries, North Macedonia, Montenegro, Albania, and Bosnia and Herzegovina, and the Republic of Serbia, align themselves with this statement. I reiterate today our conviction that the economic, commercial, and financial embargo imposed by the United States on Cuba has a damaging impact on the country's economic situation and negatively affects the living standards of the Cuban people. We should not forget that external trade and foreign investment can play a crucial role in setting the country on a path towards modernization, reforms, and sustainable growth, and help it to overcome the economic hardship caused by external events, such as the COVID-19 pandemic, which continues to affect the island, or regular meteorological and climate change-related hazards. Consequently, the EU believes that lifting the embargo could make economic reforms more effective and facilitate the opening of the Cuban economy in the benefit of the Cuban people. We remain concerned about the human rights situation in Cuba, in particular following the events on the 11th and 12th of July 2021, following the severe rulings handed down by Cuban courts hitherto as regards civil and political rights. Consequently, we reiterate our appeal to the Cuban government to fully grant its citizens internationally recognized civil, political, economic rights and freedoms, including freedom of assembly, freedom of expression, and free access to information. We call upon Cuba to release all political prisoners, to ratify the UN Covenant for Civil and Political Rights and the Covenant for Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and we call upon Cuba to extend a standing invitation to all UN special procedures to visit Cuba. We strongly insist upon the importance of upholding the UN Charter and of respecting the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of all UN members. And we urge Cuba to stand in full solidarity with these fundamental principles and to work together to defend them. Moreover, we firmly believe that empowering civil society is vital for the promotion and protection of all human rights, and we call upon the Cuban government to open spaces for constructive and inclusive dialogue without preconditions with the full spectrum of the island's civil society. A broad spectrum of civil society, both Cuban and European, should also be involved in the implementation of the EU-Cuba Political Dialogue and Cooperation Agreement, the PDCA. The EU believes that the path to positive change in Cuba is closer engagement on all levels, government, economy, civil society, but positive change can also be brought about through people-to-people exchanges. Consequently, we welcome the measures announced by the US administration last year to ease restrictions on family remittances and travel to the island, and to fully resume consular services. However, the redesignation of Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism by the previous US administration without the presentation of any new facts, and Cuba's maintenance on the list without obvious justification, has produced additional obstacles to international financial transaction with the island. Moreover, the embargo continues to restrict Cuba's ability to import inter alia pharmaceutical products, medical devices, and other medical supplies. Beyond the damaging impact of the embargo on ordinary Cubans, US sanctions and other administrative and judicial measures are also negatively affecting the economic interests of the European Union. We have firmly and continuously opposed any such measures due to their extraterritorial application and their impact on the European Union, and this in violation of commonly accepted rules of international trade. We cannot accept such measures impeding our economic and commercial relations with Cuba. The EU strongly rejects the US's activation of Titles 3 and 4 of the Helms-Burton Act in April 2019. This activation breaches the commitments made by the US in the US-EU agreements of 1997 and 1998. We will avail ourselves of all appropriate measures to address the effects of the Helms-Burton Act, including in relation to our WTO rights and through the use of the EU blocking statute. That statute protects against the extraterritorial application of those US sanctions to US citizens, businesses, and NGOs operating in Cuba. Mr. President, for the European Union, international cooperation, dialogue, and closer, even critical engagement are the way to go where Cuba is concerned. The provisional application of the EU-Cuba Political Dialogue and Cooperation Agreement, the PDCA, is now in its 6th year. The agreement has put our bilateral relationship on new and solid legal footing. It sets forth an agenda of critical engagement with Cuba that will also allow us to support and accompany Cuba on its path of reform and modernization. We are enhancing dialogue and cooperation also on issues on which we still have fundamental differences. To this end, the aforementioned PDCA has established a human rights dialogue as a key pillar of our relationship. The 4th formal meeting of the dialogue is scheduled to be held on the 24th of November. Following the adoption of the country's new constitution and in order to overcome the current economic and social crisis, we call upon Cuba to ensure that its reform agenda extends economic, judicial, and social reforms, and to ensure that it is implemented in a manner that addresses the key concerns of the Cuban people. Moreover, its implementation must meet the legitimate democratic aspirations of the Cuban people for more opportunities to participate in shaping the country's future. The PDCA is an agreement that allows the EU to offer Cuba a consistent and reliable partnership to support Cuba as it seeks to reform its political and economic model, to pursue sustainable development, and to find common solutions to global challenges, while continuing to advocate democracy and for the respect of human rights in the interests of all Cuban citizens. It is our considered view that the U.S. embargo does not contribute to promoting these aims. On the contrary, it hinders their achievement. Against this backdrop, the member states of the European Union voted unanimously in favor of the draft resolution. Thank you.
I thank the delegation of Spain on behalf of the European Union, and I'll give the floor to the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, members of the General Assembly. The United States stands resolutely with the Cuban people. We strongly support their pursuit of a future with respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. Approximately 1,000 political prisoners remain behind bars in Cuba, more than at any point in Cuba's recent history. Nearly 700 of those detentions owe to the historic July 11th, 2021 protests during which members of civil society, including human rights defenders as well as minors of age, exercised their freedom of expression and right of peaceful assembly. We share the Cuban people's dream of democracy in Cuba and join international partners in calling for the Cuban government to immediately release all those unjustly detained. Despite Cuba's membership in the UN Human Rights Council, the Cuban government has delayed responding to requests to send independent experts to Cuba who would help advance respect for human rights, including freedom of expression, freedom of religion or belief, and the freedom to assemble peacefully. Some of these requests have remained pending for 10 years. Sanctions are one set of tools in our broader effort toward Cuba to advance democracy and promote respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms in Cuba. We therefore oppose this resolution. We recognize the challenges the Cuban people face. That is why U.S. sanctions include exemptions and authorizations relating to the exports of food, medicine, and other humanitarian goods to Cuba. The United States remains a significant source of humanitarian goods to the Cuban people and one of Cuba's principal trading partners. In 2002 alone, U.S. companies exported over $295 million worth of agricultural goods to Cuba, including food, to help meet the needs of the Cuban people. The United States opposes this resolution. We encourage this body to urge the Cuban government to adhere to its human rights obligations and listen to the Cuban people and their aspirations to determine their own future. Thank you, Mr. President.
We have had the last speaker in explanation of vote after the vote. The exercise of right of reply has been requested. May I remind members that statements in exercise of the right of reply are limited to 10 minutes for the first intervention and 5 minutes to the second intervention, and should be made by delegations in their seats. I call on the representative of Cuba to exercise that right.
Gracias.
Thank you, Mr. President. I use the right to reply in light of the statement made by the representative of the United States. Once again, with old and new pretexts, the government of the U.S. is trying to in vain justify a policy which is illegal and morally unsustainable, even when, in an overwhelming way, the General Assembly has confirmed over more than 3 decades an unequivocal message that the international community recognizes the urgency of putting an end to the economic and commercial embargo against Cuba. The USA is imposing the most serious siege and with the greatest impact in terms of the coercive measures undertaken against Cuba. What was announced in May 2022 with regard to visas, remittances, and travel to Cuba does not change the principal measures that enhance the blockade and which have caused a severe worsening in the living conditions of the Cuban people since 2019 till today. The speech of the United States is hypocritical and dishonest. The criminal, economic, commercial, and financial embargo against the people of Cuba is a cruel violation which is massive and been on over a long time and cannot be justified in any way, even with the lies and the calumnies and the legends that the White House and the State Department seeks to use to justify its measures. For several thousands of children over 18 years, they have been injured or harmed by measures by the U.S. and there have been several hundred shootings in schools since 1970. The systemic racism in that country, the police brutality, the repressive policy against migrants, and the repression of the reproductive rights and extrajudicial executions and the use of torture are just some of the condemned practices committed in the United States and which are a scandal to the whole world. The United States' complicity with the massive assassination of citizens in Gaza at the hand of the IDF means that it is participating in a crime against humanity. Mr. President, the U.S. delegation cites inflated figures with regard to humanitarian aid to our country, and it talks about multi-million funds that the United Agency for International Development is sending for subversion in Cuba, and which are used to for Cuban immigrants and the beneficiaries. This is all just making many obstacles to the delivery of support from NGOs. It's totally false that the United States is providing medicine to Cuba. There is irrefutable proof that the blockade prevented the official channels for sending aid to the country, including from third countries, in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. The restrictions for the export of medicines to Cuba are explicitly covered by laws, and this is an arm of aggression, a weapon of aggression against